Anywhere you are across the globe, I want to categorically say that you coming across this video is not a mistake. Yes, it's not. You see, this video is God's way of preserving you from a world event that usually happens once every 7 to 9 years. In the coming days, many will be affected, and many will be left in tears, running up and down. But you see, God wants you exempted. Kindly tell us where you are watching this video from so that we can pray with you and your family. Also, watch this video to the end to fully understand this experience. I will begin sharing this experience. I do not know how to begin this. I have tried many times over these past days, and each time I sit down and put my hands near the keyboard, I feel something inside me tighten up, and I have to stop and breathe and remind myself why I am doing this, why I am sharing something so personal, why I am placing something so sacred in a space where anyone can read it and decide what they think about me or about what happened to me. But the truth is, I am not sharing this for myself. I am not sharing it because I want people to look at me or because I am searching for any kind of recognition or validation. I am sharing this because if I hold this inside and say nothing, I will have received something I was not meant to keep to myself. Something that was given to me for a reason that went beyond my own understanding of what I needed or wanted. Something carried back from a place that most people never return from, and carried back specifically so that it could reach other people. I died on the 2nd of June, 2026. I say that as plainly as I know how because that is exactly what happened. There was no slow fading. There was no warning I recognized as a warning. There was no gradual withdrawal. One moment I was here, present and alive in the ordinary sense, and the next moment I was somewhere else entirely. The transition happened with a speed and a completeness I still find difficult to adequately convey. The leaving was not painful. I want to say that clearly because fear of dying sits in most people without ever being examined. The act of leaving this body and this world did not hurt. It felt more like stepping through a door that had always been there but that I had never noticed. And when I stepped through it, the world I had come from became something behind me. Quiet, distant, real but receding. And what was ahead was something I had no prior experience or framework for. The space I arrived in was filled with light. Not light the way you know light in this world. Not sunlight or lamplight or the light of a screen or a fire. This light was alive. I have turned that phrase over many times since I came back, looking for something more precise. And alive is still the closest I can get to what I actually mean. The light seemed to be aware that I was there. It felt the way it feels when someone who genuinely loves you enters a room and you sense their presence before you even turn to look. Warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Warm the way being completely known and completely accepted and completely safe can feel all at the same moment without any condition attached to any of it. Without any requirement that you perform or manage or explain yourself. Just complete acceptance, expressed as light. My form in that place felt different from anything I had felt before in any living moment. Something that I had been carrying so long I had stopped recognizing it as a separate weight had simply been set down. I felt the absence of it the way you feel the relief when you put down a heavy bag after carrying it for hours. The sudden lightness. The realization of just how heavy it had been now that it was no longer with me. I stood in that light and I felt completely still. Not the stillness of someone making an effort to be calm. Not the stillness of someone suppressing anxiety or working consciously at managing their breathing. The stillness of someone who has simply arrived somewhere that requires no further effort, who can just be here. I have to pause on that stillness because it matters. I have spent most of my adult life in a kind of low-level mental motion that I had stopped recognizing as motion at all. The constant processing of information. The analysis that my work requires, the preparation for the next decision, the next presentation, the next thing that needs to be understood or figured out. Even in moments that were supposed to be restful, part of my mind was usually running on something, going over something, preparing something. I did not fully realize how constant that internal activity was until it stopped, until I was standing in that light and it was simply not happening. The machinery was quiet. And what I discovered in that quiet was that it had a quality to it that I had never encountered before. It was not empty silence. It was full of something I do not have a word for. Something that was both completely peaceful and completely awake at the same time. Alert without urgency. Present without pressure. I stood there and I understood, for the first time in my life, what it might feel like to simply exist, without the next thing, without agenda. Just here and just present, and that being enough. I do not know how long I stood like that. Time in that place did not move the way time moves here. There was no clock and no urgency and no sense that I was losing any of it. I was simply there and it was complete in itself. And then I became aware of what was in front of me. It did not appear suddenly. It came into focus gradually. like the way something emerges when fog lifts, except there was no fog. What I can say is that I was looking at it without yet fully seeing it, and then I was looking at it and seeing it completely, and in between those two states there was a process I cannot measure or describe. The knowing came before the seeing, and then the seeing confirmed the knowing, and both together were nothing I had words for. What I saw was a structure, massive in its presence, though presence is an unusual word to apply to something that was not physical. 12 forms arranged it together, all of them growing from and connected to a single base, a single root, a central point from which each of the 12 extended outward and upward. 12 distinct things sharing one common origin, and each group of them was in a completely different condition from the others. The first 6, I looked at them and saw ice, clear, thick, solid ice encasing each of those 6 from base to tip. And what stopped me immediately was the quality of that ice. It was not threatening. There was nothing violent or imprisoning about it. The forms within the ice looked at rest, settled in the way that completed things settle when they have done what they came to do. There was a comfort to those first 6 frozen forms that was visible and real, and that I felt rather than just observed. Around them, encircling the whole arrangement, there was a shimmer, a steady, beautiful glittering, the light of that place catching the surfaces of the ice and being reflected back in many directions. Something genuinely beautiful in the quiet way that things are beautiful when they are simply in their right state. Not dramatic, just right. I stood there and took in those first 6 for a long time. My professional mind was trying to find the analytical framework, filing the details, looking for the pattern, and the pattern would not resolve. I had observation without interpretation, data without the model, and I know that state well enough to know that when interpretation will not come from your own effort, the right thing is to stop straining and wait. Then I looked at the 3 forms that came after the first 6, and I stopped. All 3 were on fire, not a gentle or contained fire. This fire was hard and aggressive and purposeful, in a way that made it feel like it had been specifically assigned to those 3 forms with a clear intention. It was pressing against them, driving into them, working to break them apart. You could see the stress in the structures beneath the flame, the pressure of the fire working toward cracking them, fracturing them, reducing them. The fire was not simply burning. It was laboring against those 3 forms with a focused and sustained force that showed no sign of diminishing, and it was not stopping. That was the thing that settled most heavily in me as I watched. This fire had somewhere it intended to go, and it intended to keep going until it got there. Watching those 3 burning forms, I felt something in my chest that was close to grief. Not despair, not the end of hope, but genuine, heavy sadness at what I was seeing, and knowing that what I was seeing represented something real, that was still ahead of real people living real lives. Then I looked at the final 3, the 10th, the 11th, the 12th, not frozen and not burning, a dull, spent stillness, the kind that belongs to something that has been through a great deal and is now simply enduring, surviving without shining, getting through without any particular quality of flourishing, just present and tired. I held all 12 in my attention, and I was trying to understand and not understanding. The meaning was there, pressing at the edge of my perception, but I could not reach it from within my own resources. And then Jesus was there. He was simply present, the way the light was present, the way the warmth was present. No approach I could observe. He was just there, and the moment he was there, everything I had been straining toward on my own became unnecessary. His presence communicated without words that understanding was going to come now, and that it was going to come from him rather than from any effort of my own. The entire quality of the space changed. The 12 forms before us stopped feeling like a mystery and started feeling like something arranged and waiting to be explained. He extended his hand, I took it, and we walked. I need you to understand something before I go any further. When I say I took his hand, I am not talking about something that happened in a dream that faded when I woke up. I am talking about something that felt more real than most of the real things I have touched in my life. My heart was moving in a way that I cannot fully describe. It was not fear exactly. It was more like standing at the edge of something very large, and knowing that what you are about to hear is going to change the way you see everything else from this point forward. My hands were trembling, my eyes were wet, and I had not even heard anything yet. I was just walking, just holding his hand and walking past those 12 forms, and already something inside me knew that I was carrying something back with me that I had not come looking for. As we moved together alongside the 12 forms, understanding arrived whole, not in pieces I had to assemble. He revealed to me that each form was a month of this year, 2026. The single root from which they all grew was the year itself, and the condition of each group of forms was a representation of what those months carried for the world, and for America in particular. 12 horns, 12 months, 1 root, 1 year. The first 6 frozen forms were January through June. He showed me what happened in those months, and I recognized every event. The escalation in the Middle East leading to direct military engagement involving Iran, Israel, and American forces. The diplomatic fractures between nations, the economic pressures, the political turbulence across the world, the global incidents that had filled the news, and the prayers of those who were paying attention. I saw all of it. Every event from January through June was there, visible and recognizable, because I had been alive for those months, because those things had happened in front of all of us. But I am not going to walk through those events here, because you were there. You watched them happen. You know what the news said and what you felt when you heard it. You are a witness of those months just as I am. What I came back to carry is not the record of what already happened. It is what is still coming, the things ahead, the things that believers in this nation need to know about before they arrive so that they can respond while there is still time to respond. We walked past the first 6 forms and came to the 3 that were burning. Those 3 burning forms are July, August, and September. He revealed this to me with a completeness that left no uncertainty in me at all. And what he showed me about those 3 months is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Because what is coming in those months is something this nation has not experienced before in this specific combination. Not with this convergence of conditions arriving together and compounding each other and feeding each other the way they will. I want to pause here for a moment, because I know what some people will think when they hear this. They will think, this is just weather. This is just natural events. And yes, in one sense, that is exactly what it is. But the reason it was shown to me, the reason it was placed in front of me with such detail and such weight, is because the people who will feel it most are not abstractions. They are real people. Families, children, old people sitting in apartments without good cooling, farmers who borrowed money they have not paid back yet, hospital workers who are already tired. These are the people that were on his heart when he showed me this. And when I came back, they were on mine too. What begins in July begins the way large things often begin. Quietly, without announcing itself clearly for what it is. Heat spreading across large portions of the country. The kind that generates weather coverage and public health warnings, and increased sales of fans and cooling units. The kind that people deal with by staying indoors and complaining about the summer. It looks like a bad summer. Uncomfortable and concerning for vulnerable people, but within the range of what Americans have known before and adjusted to. What it does not look like from the surface is the front edge of something historic. What is not visible to the eye looking only at what is apparent is that El Nino has fully established itself across the Pacific Ocean in a way that is already reshaping the weather patterns that govern conditions across the entire North American continent. As a geographer who has studied climate systems professionally, I understood with complete clarity what I was being shown when he revealed it to me. The trade winds, those enormous persistent rivers of air that blow from east to west across the tropical Pacific in a normal year, had weakened dramatically. In some places they had reversed entirely, and the effect of that reversal was spreading outward from the Pacific into every weather system that depends on the patterns those winds normally maintain. He showed me the mechanics of this. And I want to explain what I saw in a way that makes sense to ordinary people, because the technical language can make something feel distant when what it describes is very close and very personal. Under normal conditions, those trade winds push vast volumes of warm surface water westward across the Pacific. They keep the eastern Pacific cooler and the western Pacific warmer, and that temperature contrast drives the behavior of the jet stream. The jet stream is the high-altitude river of fast-moving air that steers weather systems across the continental United States. It is like an invisible road in the sky that weather follows. When ocean temperatures shift, the jet stream shifts with them. And when the jet stream shifts, everything that depends on where it normally travels changes along with it. El Nino is what happens when those trade winds fail. The warm water slides back east. It floods the eastern Pacific with warmth. That warmth suppresses the upwelling of cold, nutrient-rich water from the deep ocean that feeds the marine ecosystems of the eastern Pacific coast. Fish populations crash or migrate. Fishing communities lose their foundation. The marine environment is disrupted in ways that take years to recover from. But the ocean does not contain its changes to itself. The ocean and the atmosphere are one system expressed in 2 mediums, exchanging heat and moisture and energy continuously. When El Nino places massive warmth in the eastern Pacific, that warmth rises into the atmosphere and alters air behavior in ways that travel hundreds of miles inland. The jet stream takes paths it does not normally take. Moisture goes where it normally does not go and stays away from where it normally arrives. For the southern portions of the country and for areas along the western coast, he showed me flooding. And I want to be careful here because the word flooding is something people hear and picture a river overflowing its banks for a few days before the water recedes. What he showed me was different, not the flooding of a single large storm. Sustained, persistent, accumulating flooding driven by rainfall arriving in quantities that the land and the drainage infrastructure and the river systems were not built to manage continuously. Rivers overflowing, drainage systems overwhelmed, neighborhoods standing underwater for days and then weeks. Roads turned into rivers that you could no longer drive on and in some cases could no longer even walk safely beside. People stranded in their homes waiting for help that could not reach everyone who needed it because the routes to reach them were themselves underwater. The number of displaced people climbing to figures that the available systems of emergency housing had no framework to absorb properly. And I want you to sit with that for a moment, because what that means in practical terms is families with nowhere to go. People who have already lost most of what they owned, standing in lines at shelters that do not have enough space. People sleeping in their cars because the shelters are full and the hotels are expensive and the family they might have stayed with is dealing with its own flooding. Emergency services receiving calls from too many places simultaneously, making painful decisions about where to go first when everyone everywhere needed help now. First responders in boats going to the most critical situations and having to leave other people waiting, not because they did not care, but because there were not enough of them and there were too many people in need. Organizations opening every available space and stretching every resource and still finding the need was greater than what they could fill. And communities doing what communities do in a crisis, helping each other, showing up for strangers, neighbors who had not spoken to each other in years suddenly sharing a boat, or sharing food, or checking on someone elderly who lived 3 doors down. Discovering in the emergency the neighbor relationships that had not existed in ordinary days. That part, I want to say, that part moved me. Because even in what he was showing me that was hard to look at, there was something in the human response that was genuinely beautiful. And simultaneously, in other regions, the opposite extreme. The altered jet stream withholding precipitation from areas that depended on summer rainfall for agriculture and water system management. Soil drying and cracking until it looked like the surface of something that had never known water. Rivers dropping to levels that exposed banks and beds that had not seen open air in decades. Reservoirs losing water faster than any rainfall was replacing it. The waterline dropping week by week in a way that left bleached rings on the rock, showing how far it had fallen. Crops that farmers had planted with borrowed money and built their whole year around beginning to fail. And when I say borrowed money, I want you to understand what that means for a farm family. That is a loan that has to be repaid whether the crop comes in or not. That is a calculation they made in the spring about what the season would bring, and a commitment they made to a bank based on that calculation. And now the ground was not cooperating with the calculation, and the bank still wanted its money, and the crop was dying in the field. Not everywhere, and not all of them, but enough in enough of the regions that supply food to the national market that the effect on food availability and prices became real and felt in grocery stores across the country. Not just in farming communities, in cities, in neighborhoods far from any farm. In the weekly shopping trip of a family that had nothing to do with agriculture and was not following any story about droughts but noticed, somewhere around the middle of July, that the numbers on the shelves were not the numbers they had budgeted for. In the dry landscape the drought was creating, wildfire found everything it needed. The conditions for fire becoming as extreme as any on record in affected regions as July moved into August. Fires starting in multiple places and spreading with a speed that was frightening even to people who had lived in fire country their whole lives and thought they understood what fire could do. Driven by winds the disrupted jet stream was producing, winds that changed direction in ways that made fires unpredictable and made the work of containing them even harder than it already was. Smoke traveling across state lines. This is something people often do not realize until they experience it. You can be 600 miles from an active fire and still breathe air that is thick with its particles. Still see a sky that has gone an odd color. Still feel something scratching at the back of your throat when you step outside. Air quality dropping to dangerous levels hundreds of miles from any active fire. The people most affected being those always most affected by environmental stress. Children whose lungs are still developing. Elderly people whose respiratory systems are already working harder than a young person's. Anyone carrying any respiratory condition into a summer that was making breathing difficult for everyone. And through all of it, the heat. Not just on certain days, not just in heat waves that arrive and break and give people a chance to recover. The release of Pacific warmth into the atmosphere, elevating baseline temperatures so that everything else was happening in conditions persistently hotter than they would otherwise have been. The flooding in heat, the fires in heat, the drought in heat, the daily work of ordinary American life in heat, that their bodies and their built environment were not comfortably designed to sustain over months. What this did to the economy he showed me with a clarity that was painful to watch, and I mean painful in a personal way, because at one point he showed me a woman in a grocery store standing in front of a shelf and looking at what was there and then looking at what was in her hand and making a calculation I recognized. The calculation of what you have to put back, what your family cannot have this week because the numbers do not work anymore. I have made that calculation before, a lot of people have, and seeing it happening to more and more families across the country because of everything that was accumulating that summer, that sat with me in a way I could not shake. Agricultural losses from flooding in some regions and drought in others disrupting the supply chains that move food from where it grows to where it is consumed. Grocery prices rising at a pace that did not give families time to adjust. Rising suddenly enough to be felt as a shock when people went to buy the basics they always bought and found the numbers on the shelves no longer matched what they had available. The cost of produce rising, the cost of protein rising, the cost of processed foods rising as ingredient and energy costs climbed throughout the supply chain. The electricity grid under sustained pressure from heat-driven demand higher than it was engineered to handle continuously. The grid is built with assumptions about how much demand will exist at any given time, and those assumptions are based on historical patterns. When a summer pushes demand consistently above the historical patterns for weeks at a time without relief, the system starts to show what it was not built to handle. Failures in some regions. Rolling blackouts that were not simple inconveniences but genuine emergencies. For people whose medical equipment required electricity to keep them alive, a blackout is not an inconvenience. It is a crisis that develops quickly and cannot wait for the power to come back on. For food businesses that could not operate without refrigeration, a blackout is not an inconvenience. It is product loss and potential closure. For households where losing cooling in sustained high heat created direct health risks, especially for the elderly and children, a blackout could become a medical emergency within hours. Bills rising for households already dealing with higher food costs. The combined financial pressure beginning to exceed what ordinary adjustment could absorb. And the word adjustment is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Because adjusting financially requires having something to adjust with. It requires having a margin, some space between what you earn and what you spend, that you can compress when costs go up. And a very large number of American families were already living without much margin before any of this began. When you are already tight and then 2 or 3 things go up at once, there is no adjustment available. You are just falling behind. And that is what he showed me happening to families across this country through those months. River systems disrupted in both directions. Some too swollen and turbulent for safe navigation. Others too low for the barge traffic that moves bulk goods cheaply through the interior of the country. The river system is infrastructure that most Americans do not think about because it works quietly in the background of everyday commerce. When it stops working, things that were invisible become visible. The cost of moving goods by alternative means rising. The price of everything that had to travel a distance to reach its consumer rising along with it. Supply chains that Americans had always treated as invisible and automatic becoming visible through their failure. Becoming visible in prices, becoming visible in empty shelves. Becoming visible in delivery delays for things people had expected to just be available. Hospital emergency departments filling with patients that no single department had been built to expect all at once. People with heat exhaustion. People with heat stroke that had progressed to life-threatening stages before they got there, because they had not recognized what was happening, or had not had transportation to come sooner. People with respiratory emergencies triggered by the air quality. People injured in flooding incidents. People whose existing chronic conditions had been pushed past what they could manage by the accumulated physical stress of a summer that was demanding everything from everyone. Staff working past the edges of their endurance. I have family members who work in healthcare, and I thought about them when I saw this. The particular kind of tired that comes from doing emotionally and physically demanding work without enough rest for long enough is different from ordinary tired. It gets into you in a different way. And the staff in those departments were carrying that kind of tired while still trying to give every patient what that patient needed. Waiting areas overflowing. People in genuine distress waiting for hours because there was no other option. resources being consumed at rates that already strained supply chains were struggling to sustain. Many of the patients who arrived after being stabilized had nowhere to return to. Their homes were flooded, their apartments had no power or cooling. They could not afford temporary accommodations. And this created a situation that the emergency departments were not structured to solve but could not ignore. The support systems designed for exactly this situation were overwhelmed to the point where helping everyone was not possible, and the decisions about who received help and who waited were among the most difficult that anyone in those systems had ever been asked to make. People losing their homes, to flooding directly in some cases, water taking what could not be saved, taking furniture and documents and photographs and the small objects that hold a family's history, things that cannot be replaced because they were not the kind of thing anyone thought to insure. To economic pressure in others, the combined weight of higher prices, disrupted employment, and real emergency cost pushing families who had been surviving on tight margins into a crisis their own resources could not absorb. And when families lose their housing, the ripple effects go in every direction. Children changing schools, adults losing the address they needed for job applications, people trying to hold employment while managing the logistical chaos of having no stable place to sleep, shelters filling, churches opening every door and finding the need exceeded even stretched capacity. The informal networks of mutual support that hold communities together being tested at every point simultaneously. And something that he showed me during this that I want to carry carefully, because it is both hard and important. Some of those networks held. Some of those churches found a depth of capacity and commitment they had not known they had. Some of those communities discovered in the shared difficulty things about each other and about themselves that they would not have discovered in comfortable times. That is real. That happened alongside everything that was breaking down. Both things were true at the same time. Government at every level in genuine commotion. Every resource needed somewhere. Every decision being made under compound pressure of incomplete information, exhaustion, and political complications that do not disappear because a crisis is large. There was real effort. I want to say that clearly. He showed me real institutional effort at every level. People in government working long hours and making hard calls with the best information they had. And there was real strain that everyone could feel that colored every interaction between government and the people it was trying to serve. Both of those things were real. This was July. And then August, the second burning horn. And I want to sit here for a moment before I describe what August looked like, because I think it is important to understand the weight of what that word means in this context. July did not end and leave behind a population that was recovered and rested and ready for a new month. July ended and left behind a population that was exhausted, that had been through weeks of heat and flooding and fire and economic pressure and disrupted routines and the particular emotional weight of watching your neighbors suffer and not being able to make it stop. August began before July had finished its work, before the displaced had found stable housing, before the hospitals had worked down their waiting rooms, before the farms had figured out what the season's losses were going to mean for their finances, before anyone had recovered, because El Nino does not arrive and depart in weeks, it persists. The underlying conditions that had driven July's crisis were still present in August and still active. The flooding was not quickly receding. In some places it was still rising. The drought was deepening in the regions it had already taken hold of. The heat was still elevated. The economic losses were accumulating. The displaced were still displaced. The businesses that had been struggling were more deeply in trouble. The hospitals had not recovered from July's demands before August began adding its own. He showed me the particular quality of August in a way that was hard to watch, because it was the month where people who had held themselves together through July started to show the cost of that. The exhaustion becoming visible in faces. People crying in places where they had managed to stay composed before. People saying things to each other that they would not have said if they had slept properly and eaten properly and not been carrying the weight of everything that had been on top of them for weeks. Communities that had been genuinely generous in the first days of the crisis, beginning to feel the friction that sustained crisis always produces when the resources are not infinite and the need keeps coming. He showed me the international dimension too, and this is something I have thought about a lot since coming back, because it is something Americans do not always naturally think about when we are in the middle of our own difficulty. American agricultural disruption reducing the supply of what other nations depended on American farms to produce. Nations that had built their food security plans around consistent American agricultural output, facing shortfalls of their own as a result of what was happening in American fields. And this is not a small thing. The United States produces a significant portion of the grain and other agricultural commodities that feed people in other parts of the world. When that supply shrinks or becomes more expensive, the effects travel. Trade relationships complicated by the reality that America was visibly under severe internal pressure. Other nations watching, some with genuine concern, some with the careful attention to their own interests that geopolitical reality always produces when a major actor shows sustained strain. The positioning of nations relative to each other shifting in ways that would have consequences extending well beyond the immediate crisis and the immediate year. He showed me that the ripples from what was happening inside American borders were moving outward in ways that the people inside those borders were too busy dealing with their immediate situation to fully see. And I want to say something here that I think is important. When I was being shown all of this, when I was watching the weight of August pile onto the weight of July, I had a moment of something that I can only describe as grief. Not for any single thing I was seeing, for the accumulation of it. For the ordinary people who had not chosen any of this and were just trying to hold their lives together in the middle of conditions that made holding your life together genuinely hard. I felt that grief in my chest in a way that was physical. And he did not rush past it. He let me feel it. And somehow that made what I was being shown feel more rather than less bearable. Because grief that is acknowledged is different from grief that you are asked to suppress. September, the third burning horn. And by the time we reached September in what he was showing me, I think I understood already what September was going to look like. Because September is where the bill comes due for 3 months of a crisis that never fully stopped between months. The accumulated weight of 3 months of unrelenting pressure became most fully visible in every number used to measure economic health and human well-being. Businesses that had been trying to hold on through July and August closing in September because they had exhausted whatever reserve they had. Small businesses especially, the kind that are owned by people who have everything they own tied up in them, who have put in years of work and years of savings into a restaurant or a shop or a service business, and who found that the combination of reduced foot traffic and higher costs and disrupted supply chains and the general economic contraction of a community under stress had finally reached the point where continuing was no longer possible. Workers let go as employers could no longer absorb the cost of keeping them, and each of those workers is a family adjusting, a mortgage or a rent payment becoming uncertain, a child watching their parent come home with news that changed the household situation. Consumer confidence falling in a way that further contracted spending and investment and hiring, creating a feedback loop that made beginning recovery harder. This is one of the things about economic downturns that is genuinely difficult. The psychology and the economics feed each other. When people are not confident, they spend less. When they spend less, businesses take in less. When businesses take in less, they hire fewer people or let people go. When people lose jobs or worry about losing jobs, they spend less. The loop reinforces itself and the escape from it requires something to break the pattern. And in September, with the underlying conditions still present and the accumulated fatigue of 3 months still very much in the population, nothing was available to break the pattern yet. The economic data from September told a story that was genuinely difficult to read with any optimism. And that difficulty, that absence of good news where people had expected some by now, affected the psychology of the whole country in ways that mattered. That made recovery itself harder, because recovery depends partly on confidence, and confidence was in genuinely short supply. People had expected that by September something would be turning around, and when September arrived, and the data was still bad, and the news was still heavy, and the cost of groceries was still high, and the jobs were still uncertain, the absence of the expected turn was its own additional weight. I want to be honest about something. Standing there, watching September's form, with the full weight of July and August already in me, I felt something that I think might be called despair for just a moment. Not the kind of despair that gives up, but the kind that has to acknowledge honestly that things are genuinely hard before it can find its way to something else. And he allowed that moment. He did not immediately rush to comfort. He let what I was seeing be fully real to me before he showed me what came next. I think there was something important in that. Because what he showed me next needed to be received by someone who had allowed the difficulty to be real, not someone who had minimized it or jumped past it too quickly. We walked past those 3 burning horns, and I felt the weight of what I had seen settle into me in a way that was quiet and permanent. It did not feel like something I would gradually forget. It felt like something that had been placed inside me to stay. My eyes were wet again, my chest was heavy, and I was aware of my own breathing in a way I am not usually aware of it. We walked, and the walking helped. And then we came to the final three: October, November, December. The dull, quiet, spent forms. I understood their quality completely now. Not because they explained themselves immediately, but because everything that had come before had made their meaning clear. El Nino was weakening as the season turned. The most extreme conditions were easing. The emergency was moving into recovery. And recovery, as anyone who has studied disaster response knows, is in many ways harder than the emergency itself. The emergency concentrates collective attention and produces a surge of mutual aid and shared purpose. People know what they are doing. They know they are responding. There is a clarity to it, even in the chaos, that gives people direction. Recovery is slow and requires sustained commitment when there is no dramatic moment to organize around, and when the initial surge of solidarity has begun to find its natural limits in a population that is also exhausted from everything it has been through. He showed me Americans doing that work, in October and November and December. Not perfectly, not without ongoing friction and strain that did not disappear when the acute crisis passed, but genuinely doing it. Getting up and doing the work of rebuilding, even when it was slow, and even when the immediate dramatic reason to push had faded, and even when the cameras had moved on to other stories. Communities that had found each other in the flooding, and the fire staying together through the slow months of rebuilding. Neighbors remaining connected in ways they had not been before July. That practical intimacy that crisis creates, where you know your neighbor's situation because you helped each other survive it, was continuing into these quieter months. And some of those connections were becoming something more permanent, something that was going to outlast the crisis and change those neighborhoods in ways that ordinary, comfortable life would never have produced. Faith communities and organizations that had stretched themselves through the summer, continuing to show up through the autumn, even when the emergency funding was drying up. This is the part that is often invisible in the coverage of disasters. The moment when the official funding ends and the news cameras leave and the outside volunteers go home. That is the moment that separates the communities that recover from the communities that do not, in many cases. It is what happens after the spotlight is gone. And he showed me churches and organizations and ordinary people showing up in October and November without a camera watching, without recognition, without the particular energy that comes from being part of an emergency everyone is paying attention to. Just showing up because someone still needed them to. Government at every level making decisions about how to address what the summer had painfully exposed, about vulnerabilities in infrastructure and emergency systems and social support networks that had always been present but had never been so clearly revealed. Some of those decisions were difficult politically. Some of them required acknowledging things that institutions had avoided acknowledging. But they were being made. The crisis had created a clarity about what needed attention that was one of the unexpected gifts of the hard months. He showed me something in those recovery months that I found genuinely moving. And I want to try to describe it carefully because I do not want to make it sound like more than it was, or less than it was. People discovering in the shared difficulty that they were more capable of care and generosity than they had known before any of this began. Not all people in all places, but real numbers of real people in real communities finding out that what they were able to give when giving was genuinely needed was more than they had thought they could give. That discovery does not leave you when the crisis passes. It changes something about how you understand yourself. It goes with you. Communities discovering resources of resilience in themselves and in each other that ordinary, comfortable life had never required them to locate. And this is something I want to say clearly because I think it matters. Ordinary, comfortable life is a gift. I am not suggesting that suffering is necessary or that difficulty is something we should seek out. But he showed me that what those 3 hard months had pulled out of those communities, the reserves of care and capacity and connection that had been there the whole time and had never needed to be accessed before, those reserves were real. They had always been real. The crisis had just made them visible. Churches becoming centers of real and sustained community in ways they had not been in years. He showed me this with a particular tenderness, I think. People who had not been inside a church in a long time showing up because the church had opened its doors in July and had not closed them. People who had never had any particular religious practice finding themselves in a community of care that operated out of those buildings and being moved by what they found there. And the people already in those churches discovering that their building and their community could hold more than they had thought, could serve more people, could be more present in the actual life of their neighborhood than it had been in ordinary times. The ordinary human miracle of people showing up for each other when showing up is hard and requires real sacrifice. I want to call it ordinary because it was happening in ordinary places with ordinary people. And I want to call it a miracle because what I saw in it was something that transcended the circumstances that produced it. Both words are true. And by December, by the end of the year, he showed me something I would call victory without any hesitation. Not spectacular victory. Not the complete restoration of everything that had been damaged. The quiet, earned, deeply human victory of a people who went through something severe and came out the other side still standing. Still here. Still committed to each other and to the future they would have to build together. I stood there at the end of those 12 forms with him beside me, and I let myself feel the fullness of December. The weariness of it, yes. The ongoing need, yes. But also something that I think was genuinely hope. Not the easy kind. Not the kind that arrives before you have needed it. The kind that comes after. The kind that knows exactly what it cost and chooses to continue anyway. That kind of hope has a weight to it that lighter hope does not have, and that weight makes it more valuable, not less. That is a real victory. Not a comfortable or an easy one, but genuine. The kind that comes from endurance and from the discovery that endurance was possible when people were not sure it was. The kind that changes the people who experience it in ways that matter for a long time afterward. The people who went through those months together were going to be different from the people they had been in June. Not all of them in all the ways, but enough of them in enough of the ways that it would matter. That it would show up in how they treated each other, and what they valued, and what they were willing to do for a neighbor they had only just met. It was at that point, standing at the end of those 12 forms with him beside me, that he revealed the full purpose of everything I had been shown. He made it clear that this was not information alone, not a spiritual forecast delivered for passive reception, like a weather report you listen to and then go about your day. He revealed that the people who pray, the believers who understand that prayer is not a passive ritual but a genuine force operating in the real world with real consequences. Those people needed to hear this, needed to hear it specifically, needed to hear it now. He revealed that what is coming in those 3 burning months is not fixed in every detail. And I want to stay with that for a moment because I think it is the most important thing I came back carrying. The reason it is shown in advance is precisely because advanced knowledge is meant to produce advanced response. A warning that changes nothing is not a warning. It is just early news. He was calling for a response from the people who knew how to give one. The reason I was shown this was not so I could describe it to you and have you carry it as information. It was so that what I described would move you to do something with it. The response he called for was prayer, sustained, serious, collective, fervent prayer. And when I say those words, I am aware that they can sound like words that get said in religious contexts without carrying their full weight. So let me try to say what I mean more directly. He was not calling for a moment of prayer. He was not calling for a quick conversation with God on the way to work. He was calling for people to treat the urgency of what is coming with the urgency it actually deserves. The kind of prayer that does not happen once and feel satisfied with itself. The kind that returns every day, that gathers others, that treats this like the serious thing it is. He revealed that the severity of those 3 burning months can be shaped by prayer, not eliminated, not replaced by something comfortable, but shaped. The most vulnerable people can be covered by the intercession of believers who take this seriously. The hand of God can be made visible in ways that would not otherwise be visible. In the flooding and the heat and the economic pressure and the displaced families and the overwhelmed hospitals, the hand of God can be present in ways that change specific outcomes for specific people. But that requires believers to take their role seriously, to press into God with genuine faith and genuine persistence on behalf of a nation whose people will need it desperately whether they know what is coming or not. And the specific window he pointed to was this month, June, the days still remaining before June ends. He revealed that what believers do in prayer before June closes has a significance that should not be underestimated, that this is not a moment to assume someone else is handling this, that this is a moment for every believer who hears this to take it personally, to go to God, to find others and pray with them, to fast if they are able, to gather in their churches and their homes and their prayer circles and press in together with a seriousness that matches the seriousness of what is revealed. He revealed that intercessors must rise, that the people who know how to stand in the gap and hold a position in prayer must hear this and stand up. And when he said that, I felt something shift in me, because I know what it means to stand in the gap. I know what it costs. I know the discipline and the faith and the returning again when you do not feel like returning that is required to hold a position in prayer over weeks and months. And he was calling for that. He was not calling for something easy or comfortable. He was calling for people who would take this seriously in a way that matched the seriousness of what is coming. That the ordinary believers who have never thought of themselves as intercessors must understand that right now, in this window, their prayer counts. This is something I felt very strongly when he revealed it. And I want to carry it carefully because I think it is easy to hear about intercessors rising and feel that it does not apply to you, that it is for someone else, someone more spiritual or more trained or more practiced. But he was clear. He was not only calling the experienced intercessors. He was calling everyone who belongs to God and has a voice before him. Their cry on behalf of a nation and its people, and the most vulnerable among them, counts in ways that they may never fully see or measure, but that are real and consequential in the economy of God. And then I woke up. I was back. In this body, in this world, with its weight and its limitations and its full distance from where I had been. I lay there for a few moments just breathing, just letting the reality of being back settle over me. Every single detail of what I had seen and been shown was present in my memory with a clarity and precision that has not diminished in the days since then. Nothing faded. Nothing softened at the edges the way dreams dissolve within minutes of waking. All of it still here. Still clear, still pressing outward, still demanding to be shared. I did not jump up immediately. I did not go to a phone or a computer or try to write anything down. I sat for a long time in the quiet of the early morning, and I held what I had experienced, and I felt the weight of being the person who had been sent back with it. I am not a prophet. I am not a theologian. I have no special standing in any church or any spiritual community. I am a geographer. I study land and water and climate. I am the most ordinary kind of messenger that God could possibly have chosen, and I think that is probably the point. I am a geographer. I understand El Nino and trade winds and the jet stream and the way disrupted weather patterns move through agriculture and supply chains and economies and the daily lives of ordinary families trying to make the month work on what they have. Everything I was shown is consistent with what climate science and my own professional knowledge tells me is possible under these conditions. What made it revelation rather than analysis was the combination and the timing and the detail, and above all the presence that walked me through all of it, and the purpose with which I was sent back to share it. I am not writing this so that you will be afraid. Fear is not the message, and fear is not the point. The message is that there is still time, that God showed this in advance because advance warning is itself an act of mercy, because he wants his people to rise and to pray and to intercede on behalf of a nation that is about to face something genuinely hard. The believers who rise and pray in the remaining days of June, who seek the face of God with genuine urgency and genuine faith, are participating in something with real consequences for real people. The hand of God can be visible in those burning months. The severity can be reduced. The most vulnerable can be covered. But that requires the church to be the church and to do what the church alone is positioned to do. If you are a believer and something in you is responding to what you have read here, if something in you recognizes the weight and the urgency of it and the realness of it, that response is not nothing. Do not dismiss it. Honor it. Act on it. Pray. Fast if you are able. Gather with others who take their faith seriously and pray together. Seek the face of God before June ends, before this window closes, because what you do now matters to what those months will hold for the people who will live through them. The time is now. Please do not wait.